everyone, welcome back. We have finally arrived at episode 7, The Clouded Mountain. This episode was jam-packed full of all the things I love, namely things about the authority. We get to visit the Kingdom of Heaven, which is the Clouded Mountain itself. The battle between the Kingdom of Heaven and the Republic of Heaven really begins in earnest, and we see all of the powers lining up against one another. We lose two of our most intriguing characters in an absolutely devastating way. God maybe dies. We'll talk about that. And Lyra and Will finally reach some kind of safety at the very end. So lots going on, lots to discuss. Let's hop right into it. This episode starts with the Clouded Mountain approaching Asriel's headquarters slowly. Seeing this, Asriel's council meets to strategize, and we hear Asriel reflect on the idea that his entire life he has pushed back hard against religion, stories, superstition, anything that isn't quite scientific, and yet here he is at the brink of war, realizing that his entire mission, his whole life's purpose really, depends on the fate of his daughter and her demon. This guides him to the realization that it's no longer his job to defeat Metatron, he just needs to distract Metatron and keep him occupied while Lyra, Pan, Will, and Will's demon eventually reach safety. This really points to how much Asriel has changed in the last few days through his conversation with Zephania, with Seraphina, with Yurg Burnison. Asriel has really come to accept the fact that he is not the central figure of this rebellion any longer, that all of the importance that he had put upon himself, all of the glory, has actually rested with his daughter. In the end, in the history books, yes, maybe his name will be remembered, but Lyra is really the star of the show, and he needs to get over his ego and ensure her safety, and he's doing that for once. After Asriel's council meeting ends, he shows Mrs. Coulter the device that he's been working on. He clarifies that this device will help him drag Metatron into the abyss, keeping him there forever so that there will be no escape. When Mrs. Coulter asks him how he plans on taking Metatron down, he says that he's going to use sheer physical force, and he reminds Mrs. Coulter that angels are not made of flesh and bone like humans are, they're made of something much less substantive. Asriel states that not only are humans stronger than angels, but that angels actually envy humans, and I believe this implants an idea in Mrs. Coulter. In a moment of particular vulnerability, Asriel also tells Mrs. Coulter that all this time he was certain that he was going to change the world, but that title will instead go to Lyra, which is a pretty astonishing thing for someone to say when that person believes so heartily in his own mission. He says, "I've given the girl nothing, but at the very least I can buy her time." And then he asks Mrs. Coulter to stay behind at Asriel's headquarters and detonate the bomb for him. They look at each other, and I think she understands exactly what he's saying. He is not planning to survive this moment. Mrs. Coulter seems to be feeling a little bit less optimistic than Asriel, and we see a conversation between her and Zephania take place. It kind of bursts in on Zephania while Zephania is meditating, connecting with other angels. We're not entirely sure, but she asks Zephania what Zephania thinks will happen. She seems to think that Zephania has information that she's not giving to the rest of them, that she can either predict the future or see the future in a way that us mere mortals can't. Instead of giving her any kind of prediction, Zephania tells Mrs. Coulter about herself. She tells Mrs. Coulter that her greatest strength and her greatest weakness is her love of Lyra. Mrs. Coulter has this immense power to suppress the best of herself, and there will come a time in the not too distant future when she'll really need to use that. She tells Mrs. Coulter that Metatron can see everything. Asriel knows that time is drawing short, and he and Seraphina Pekkala head outside to deliver an inspiring war speech. This is his Braveheart moment, if you will. He looks out on all of his troops from all of the worlds that have amassed together, and he tells them honestly that some of them will die that day. They are all mortals there, with the exception of his angel pals who have yet to really materialize. And with that, the idea that the authority can use the threat of heaven or hell to control behavior is done. That is no longer a concern that they need to have because, thanks to his daughter, death is no longer something to be feared. He says that death is no longer an ending, but a journey back into life. At this point, the clouded mountain is looming over Asriel's headquarters, so he takes the opportunity to hop into the intention craft and fly as close as possible to the clouded mountain. His mind has been set. He knows what he needs to do. We see him surrounded by the authorities' angels. Asriel's demon, Still Maria, says very aptly that there is indeed an advantage of not being the chosen one. They realize that they are far outnumbered, and the chances of them surviving this are slim to nil, so now is the time to really make the most of what they can do. Fortunately for Asriel, he is not alone. He is soon after joined by Serafina Pekkala and the witches that are volunteering for his side. Witches can fly, which is a nice advantage, so we have humans, witches, as well as the rebel angels ready to attack the authorities' angels. With their mission in the land of the dead complete, Will and Lyra are finally able to pursue their demons, and we see them cut into the world where Asriel's headquarters are, where all of this action is taking place, and they step through, finding themselves in definitely a war zone. Zephania perceives that Will has used the knife. She explains at some point to Mrs. Coulter and Asriel that angels can feel the world's being split apart, and so she has been waiting for this moment to alert everyone that the kids are finally in this world and need the protection. This is what Asriel has been waiting for, and he uses this message from Zephania, from the angels, that now is the time to attack, and he goes straight in for the authority, Metatron, all of it. He's ready. Asriel asks Ogunwe to take charge of finding the kids and their demons, bringing them together and making sure that they are adequately protected. Asriel is not the only one who has amassed allies of many stripes, and Zephania quickly realizes that headquarters are in trouble because the authority has summoned the specters of indifference. We see the specters looming over the camp, and it's not long before they start creating havoc. Zephania calls them demon eaters, and that is exactly what they're doing. They are decimating Asriel's troops who are still at headquarters. Zephania recognizes that this is an opportunity for Mrs. Coulter to really shine. She somehow knows that Mrs. Coulter has a way to communicate and control the specters, and she asks Mrs. Coulter to step in. And that's exactly what Mrs. Coulter does. Mrs. Coulter goes outside to call on the specters, summoning them and then somehow destroying them. It's almost like she coaxes them into self-destruction. Serafina Pekkala's demon, Kaisa, is the first to find the kids' demons, and once he locates them, he lets Serafina know. Once Serafina realizes that Kaisa has found the demons, she tells Asriel that she is going to bounce to help reunite the kids with their demons, and that is what she does. She peels off from Asriel and the other witches to go. Pan and Will's demon, whose name we still don't know, are feeling vulnerable, scared, and they've been abandoned. At about the same time, Commander Ogunwe successfully finds Lyra and Will. Ogunwe tells them that he wants to lead them to Asriel's headquarters, and the kids are quite suspicious, but he's not super aggressive about it, and he is very clear that his number one priority is to protect them. And thank goodness for that, because they are about to be attacked by cliff ghasts. Ogunwe senses that this could go very badly very quickly, so he sends the kids to Asriel's headquarters to find their demons, which is where the demons are, while he and his troops take care of these cliff ghasts that are surrounding them. Now that the specters of indifference have been destroyed by Mrs. Coulter, Metatron resorts to further hijinks and tactics to get into the heads of Lord Asriel's troops. We hear his voice booming over the headquarters, though it may also be that his voice is heard kind of internally by folks at the camp, but he's telling people that it's not too late, that if they continue down this path, they will be destroyed, but he will receive them, he will forgive them. They still have time to return to the side of righteousness, but in order to do that, they must forego their allegiance to Asriel. I really liked this touch. This wasn't something that I remember being in the book, but I love the idea that this voice of the authority is still creating fear and turmoil within the hearts of us mortals. And it seems to be working. It seems like there are factions forming within Asriel's troops. We see some folks start attacking one another, and this is really creating some mayhem. Mrs. Coulter hears this same voice of Metatron, and she has an idea. We're not sure if she's had this idea for a long time, but she walks out looking at the clouded mountain and calls out to Metatron, demanding that he show himself to her. And it works. He says, "Join me, you intrigue me." And we see this bridge appear connecting the clouded mountain to Asriel's headquarters, just waiting for Mrs. Coulter to make that journey across. Mrs. Coulter and her golden monkey demon exchange what seems like a very sad but loving look between the two of them, and she says, "You know what to do." And then we see her leave the golden monkey for the last time and step out onto that bridge to head over to the clouded mountain. And it feels like this could be a journey that she has taken before. She has always had somewhat confusing allegiances to various organizations and people. In the book, I feel like there's a bit more ambiguity. We're really not so clear about whether she will be joining the authority, whether she is betraying Asriel. I think it is a bit more obvious what's about to happen in the show, but I did appreciate us watching her physically leave Asriel's space to head into the clouded mountain. From the intention craft above, Asriel actually sees Mrs. Coulter walking across this bridge, and he takes this opportunity to fly into the clouded mountain himself, following her path that she has created. With that said, he lands somewhere else, and it's really the first glimpse that we get of the clouded mountain. We don't see him landing anywhere. He just sort of arrives there. And I couldn't help but notice that Stella Maria has disappeared in the process. Asriel is in the clouded mountain alone. When Mrs. Coulter arrives at the clouded mountain proper, we unfortunately don't get to see her journey like we do in the book, but once she gets there, she supplicates herself to Metatron, the Great Regent. I have to say that I was quite taken aback by the visual representation, the human representation that we get of Metatron. To be blunt, I thought he looked creepy as fuck with those weird CGI eyeballs, and I'm sure that was intentional, that there was supposed to be something not quite right, not quite normal about his appearance, because he is an angel after all. But I just thought that it was an interesting choice. We hear Metatron verbally undressing Mrs. Coulter's character, and he calls her a cesspit of moral filth. This was one of my absolute favorite lines in the book, and knowing me, of course I want to talk about this conversation as it occurs in the book. So here we go. This interaction between Mrs. Coulter and Metatron was brilliant, but it was missing some of the harshness and richness and wildness that the original text had. So let's read. The Prince of the Angels looked at her. It was the most searching examination Marissa Coulter had ever undergone. Every scrap of shelter and deceit was stripped away, and she stood naked, body and ghost and demon together, under the ferocity of Metatron's gaze. And she knew that her nature would have to answer for her, and she was terrified that what he saw in her would be insufficient. Lyra had lied to Yofor Ragnarsson with her words. Her mother was lying with her whole life. Yes, I see, said Metatron. What do you see? Corruption and envy and lust for power, cruelty and coldness, a vicious probing curiosity, pure poisonous toxic malice. You have never from your earliest years shown a shred of compassion or sympathy or kindness without calculating how it would return to your advantage. You have tortured and killed without regret or hesitation. You have betrayed and intrigued and gloried in your treachery. You are a cesspit of moral filth. That voice, delivering that judgment, shook Mrs. Coulter profoundly. She knew it was coming and she dreaded it, and yet she hoped for it too. And now that it had been said, she felt a little gush of triumph. Powerful words from Metatron. That line really stuck with me over the years. A cesspit of moral filth. And I remember looking up the word cesspit in the dictionary because it was new to me. Poetry, friends. Sheer poetry. A fun detail that we get in the book that we don't get in the show is Mrs. Coulter's age. I was astonished to find out that she is 35 in the story and kind of alarmed that, holy shit, she must have been so young when she had Lyra. I cannot imagine having lived that much life coming to that kind of power by the very ripe age of 35. So bless Mrs. Coulter. You've done a lot. Back in the show version of this, Mrs. Coulter and Metatron talk about power. It is something they are both in love with. It's something they both want and are very familiar with. These two seemed particularly well matched. We've seen over the course of the last 3 seasons, Mrs. Coulter's obsession with power and her manipulation of others to get it, and we get a very similar sense of Metatron. He is not here acting as regent by accident. At the same time that this conversation between Mrs. Coulter and Metatron is happening, Metatron is also completely fucking with Asriel in a different part of the Clouded Mountain. Metatron tells Asriel that Asriel is scared to face the resentment that he feels towards Lyra, his own daughter. He appears to Asriel as another Asriel, and Asriel in this way has to confront himself. We can only really tell the difference because Metatron Asriel has these very creepy, angelic looking eyes. With his mission to distract Metatron, Asriel goes ahead and attacks him, and Metatron tells him, after beating the shit out of him, that Asriel is all alone. No one will remember his name. This feels important. This feels hurtful to Asriel. We can see Asriel considering this, and he eventually rejects it, and he says, no, Marissa is here, and he calls out for her, knowing that she is also in the Clouded Mountain. In the show, we go back and forth between the scene with Asriel and Metatron and Mrs. Coulter, so we hear Asriel calling out for Marissa. We have no sense of scale. We also have no sense of time. It feels like a different world completely where time and space maybe don't exist in the same way, so I liked it, but it was a little disorienting, which I'm sure was the point. Metatron sees Mrs. Coulter as someone who could serve as a companion to him, and in a very intriguing proposition, he offers to make her an angel. He says that no one else has become an angel since the fall of Adam and Eve, but maybe she will hold this special honor. And while he is examining her, Metatron sees that Mrs. Coulter's thoughts turn to love and shame. Mrs. Coulter admits that she does indeed love Lyra, that her thoughts had temporarily shifted to Lyra, and that she absolutely hates the fact that she loves Lyra. She says that loving Lyra, and Lyra in general, makes her feel needy and helpless, and she wants those feelings gone. This is the most emotional we ever see Mrs. Coulter, and that's what made me think it was actually true. She is crying, and that love, that neediness, that vulnerability that she is admitting to feels very real. While Asriel's voice is sounding through the Clouded Mountain, and we can definitely hear it, Metatron tells Mrs. Coulter that he sees that she is capable of betrayal, and she agrees with this. It's a very nuanced moment, and we hear the word betrayal, but we're not exactly sure what it could be referring to. There are 2 ways the situation could go, and to be honest, I'm not really sure what I would have thought might be happening in the show had I not already read the book. But unfortunately or fortunately, I knew it was going to happen, so I can't say, but I think this moment could be exciting and also quite confusing for viewers who are unfamiliar with the series. We know that Mrs. Coulter is so full of deceit. We know that she loves power. We know that she has this lifelong commitment to the authority, but we also know that she's changing. And from the book, as I had read, we know that she's lying with every fiber of herself. Mrs. Coulter hears Asriel calling out for her and tells Metatron that she would like to see Asriel one last time. She wants to make sure that Asriel can see her face when he realizes what she's done. When she says that, the divisions, the walls of the Clouded Mountain seem to alter, and it seems as though Asriel and Mrs. Coulter have been in close physical proximity this whole time and just didn't know it. But Metatron and Mrs. Coulter approach Asriel on the floor. He seems to be quite injured. And Mrs. Coulter says that she really wants to get close to Asriel, not too far away. Now that Will and Lyra have reunited with their demons, Will goes ahead and cuts a window into another world where he would like the demons to go so they can be safe. And once everything has been wrapped up, they will go ahead and join their demons. And the world that he cuts into is the Mulefa world. The golden monkey detonates the device that Asriel has built, and we see the Clouded Mountain start to crumble. When Mrs. Coulter and Asriel recognize what is happening, Mrs. Coulter and Asriel look at each other and they say, "For Lyra," and we realize at this point that they are going to sacrifice themselves for their daughter. Stella Maria appears and the three of them pounce on Metatron and take him down. Stella Maria's minimal weight is what does the trick, and with her help, the three of them take Metatron down into the abyss below them, and we see them fall. We know that this abyss isn't just a large cavern, it's not a crack in the earth. This is really where dust goes to die. This is oblivion. It's not the land of the dead. There is no escape from this. There is no coming out of it. So this is really the greatest sacrifice that Mrs. Coulter and Lord Asriel could potentially make. At Asriel HQ, Lyra and Will are watching the golden monkey detonate the device, and Lyra recognizes that this is some kind of ending. And there's this moment of real sweetness between the golden monkey demon and Lyra, and she reaches out to him and he reaches out to her, but it's too late. And Lyra watches as the golden monkey demon dissolves into these motes of dust before her, this golden shimmer, and she knows that her mother is dying in the process. This is the end of Mrs. Coulter and her complicated, terrifying, beloved golden monkey demon. With this end of Mrs. Coulter, Lord Asriel, and Metatron, we see the Clouded Mountain dissipate, and this crystal box falls from the Clouded Mountain down to the earth, where it lands smack dab in the middle of Lord Asriel's camp. And it feels like the war has just been won. I was too busy bawling my eyes out to really care much about the aftermath. This moment between Lyra and the golden monkey demon really shook me. It was such a sweet and tender moment of bewildered grief and also gratitude and acceptance and a recognition that Mrs. Coulter really did love Lyra and gave her life to be the mother that she had never been before, and so had Asriel. Later in this episode, I believe, maybe in the next one, Lyra has a sense that Asriel is gone as well, but she doesn't have the proof. But we know as the audience that he is, and that these two parents finally showed up for their kid in a real, legitimate way. After the golden monkey disappears and it feels like the worst of the battle has ended, Lyra and Will head outside into the camp to survey the damage and see what's going on. The Clouded Mountain has completely disappeared, and it feels like victory. Will even notes that Asriel has won. This felt like a divergence from the spirit of the book in terms of exactly what was won and what was lost. Watching this season, I was really curious to see where the show would land on Asriel's character at the end of all of this. And I've got to say, I think the show was tremendously generous with him, with the Republic of Heaven, and with his venture. We hear throughout this episode, and a little bit in the very last episode, spoiler alert, that Asriel's plan worked, that he won the battle between the kingdom and the Republic, and that somehow we're supposed to celebrate his vision. Fun trivia fact, the name Asriel means the angel of death. Asriel in Jewish and Muslim lore, mythology, religious texts was indeed the angel of death, and I think that is not a coincidence that Philip Pullman used his name in that way for this character. Asriel is willing to make a sacrifice. We saw that at the end of the first season when he murdered Roger. We saw him again torturing Alarbus and blowing him into tiny, tiny pieces to send a message to the authority. We saw him be weirdly comfortable with Ruta Skadi dying. And I think the question that we're left with is, how many sacrifices are we willing to make for a cause? How do we weigh the scales here? Asriel's Republic, however important, however visionary it was built upon the murder of an innocent child. Can we say that because the foundation is rotten, the Enterprise is rotten too? I don't know. I think there is a lot of gray in this. There's a lot of moral complexity and haze, but I do think there is that nuance that the show maybe dismissed or didn't really explore in the way that I would have liked to see, especially because we're not getting another season of this most likely. Asriel has died, we won't see him again, and I think there needs to be some kind of reckoning. As they are walking through the camp, Lyra and Will notice this giant crystal box sitting in the middle of the chaos, and they go over to it to inspect, and Lyra feels that someone might be in the box. She asks Will to help her investigate, and he uses his knife to cut into the box. In this crystal litter, as it is described in the book, they see this old and very decrepit looking creature who seems not well, and in the show we see him holding his head. It looks like he is confused, possibly in pain, and as the kids are trying to help him out, he simply dissolves in the wind. He cannot contain his form any longer. This felt like a non-moment in the show, I'm gonna be honest. There was very little airtime given to this or any thinking of what it might have represented. But in the book, this is a very huge, monumental thing. In the book, we know that this is the so-called creator god that Lyra has liberated. She, of course, has been prophesied to be the person who kills God, and this is what killing God looks like. In the book, it is described as an act of mercy, and knowing me, of course, I will read the original passage. Sorry, not sorry. She was gazing into the crystal litter. It was unbroken, although the crystal was stained and smeared with mud and the blood from what the cliff ghasts had been eating before they found it. It lay tilted crazily among the rocks, and inside it, oh, Will, he's still alive, but the poor thing. Will saw her hands pressing against the crystal, trying to reach in to the angel and comfort him, because he was so old and he was terrified, crying like a baby and cowering away into the lowest corner. He must be so old. I've never seen anyone suffering like that. Oh, Will, can't we let him out? Will cut through the crystal in one movement and reached in to help the angel out. Demented and powerless, the aged being could only weep and mumble in fear and pain and misery, and he shrank away from what seemed like yet another threat. It's all right, Will said. We can help you hide at least. Come on, we won't hurt you. The shaking hand seized his and feebly held on. The old one was uttering a wordless groaning whimper that went on, and grinding his teeth and compulsively plucking at himself with his free hand. But as Lyra reached in too to help him out, he tried to smile and to bow, and his ancient eyes, deep in their wrinkles, blinked at her with innocent wonder. Between them, they helped the Ancient of Days out of his crystal cell. It wasn't hard, for he was as light as paper, and he would have followed them anywhere, having no will of his own, and responding to simple kindness like a flower to the sun. But in the open air, there was nothing to stop the wind from damaging him, and to their dismay, his form began to loosen and dissolve. Only a few moments later, he had vanished completely, and their last impression was of those eyes, blinking in wonder, and a sigh of the most profound and exhausted relief. Then he was gone, a mystery dissolving in mystery. It had taken less than a minute. Holy shit. Can we just acknowledge how insane that is? How heretical, how blasphemous, how wild a moment that is in the book. Here we have the creator, the so-called creator god, the Almighty, the Authority, depicted as a shrunken, sad, tired, exhausted, powerless, helpless creature that two kids liberate by ending his life. And that is how the king of the kingdom of heaven dies. I just will never get over this moment in the book and Philip Pullman's boldness, his brazenness, and I absolutely love it. Whew. So exciting. After this kind of epic moment of creator destruction, the kids go ahead and take the rest that they need, cutting back into the Malefic world to reunite with their demons. And that is how this episode ends. With a great sense of relief, the battle is over. Lord Asriel and Mrs. Coulter have died, but the kids are safe and they will be reunited in a place that feels a little bit less hectic and chaotic with their demons coming to an episode near us. What an episode. This really was an emotional roller coaster for me. I absolutely loved the conclusions of the character arcs of Mrs. Coulter and Lord Asriel. They really took us on a journey there, and this was also such a philosophically interesting episode with this non-moment of Lyra liberating God from his crystal litter. I'd love to know how you all felt about the ending. Were you emotionally impacted by the loss of the golden monkey demon like I was? Was it a surprise? Had you already read the books and knew what was coming, or were you intrigued by this double, triple agent action on Mrs. Coulter's part? What did you think about this depiction of God? Thanks so much for watching, and please join me as I discuss our last episode of his Dark Materials.